Universidad Militar Nueva Granada, en Bogotá, Colombia. Transmite UMNG Radio. UMNG Radio. Una emisora alternativa, cultural e independiente. Desde la Universidad Militar Nueva Granada. Esta es UMNG Radio.
Tune in and speak up. Hello, English learners. Want to learn something interesting whilst having fun? Welcome to Tune In and Speak Up, the podcast where you'll get to know this beautiful language in depth. Each week, we'll dive into exciting topics, share practical tips, and tell you fascinating English language stories. So whether you're studying, going to work, or just relaxing, connect, listen, and let's make English part of your world. Wherever you are, whenever you want, just hit play, tune in and listen up. Tune in to UMNG Radio every Tuesday from 11 a.m. till noon. Don't just learn English, live it.
Of the 20th century and the events that accelerated the spread and institutionalization of English around the world. So before these wars, English had already begun an international journey thanks to the expansion of the British Empire. But the late 20th and the beginning of the late 19th, and the beginning of the 20th century, the British Empire was the largest empire in history, often described by the phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire." At its peak, it covered about a quarter of the world's land surface and ruled over hundreds of millions of people. In many of these colonies, such as India, Nigeria, Kenya, and Jamaica, English became the language of administration, education, and law. It was taught in schools and used in government, even if most of the population continued speaking indigenous languages at home. This gave English a foundation in regions far from its native British Isles. Wherever the British went, they established schools, courts, and administrative systems that functioned primarily in English. Even after gaining independence, many former colonies retained English as an official language due to its utility in governance and international affairs. Okay, and we have arrived in the year 1914, the beginning of the First World War I, communication in conflict. When the war erupted in 1914, it brought together an unprecedented coalition of nations. English-speaking powers like Britain, Canada, Australia, and later the United States played leading roles in the Allied effort. Soldiers, medics, and diplomats from English-speaking countries were suddenly working alongside troops from France, Italy, Russia, India, and many others. In the trenches are these long excavated areas, characteristic of the War One. So in these trenches in Europe and the deserts of the Middle East, there was an urgent need for clear communication between people who didn't share a first language. English wasn't the only lingua franca. French and German were also widely used, but its role grew steadily. Allied cooperation, military logistics, and diplomatic efforts increasingly relied on English to coordinate complex operations and negotiate terms. Moreover, the war catalyzed technological and infrastructural changes. For example, we have telegraphy on the left, we have aviation and radio broadcasting that required standardized terminology. English began to dominate these fields, laying the groundwork for its role in modern communication. So we can imagine that never before that moment, the technology had reached these new inventions. So wars had been present all along the history of humans, but for the first time, all these technologies were present, right? And that really made a change in how the war took place and how people had to communicate. The shift in global power. World War I also disrupted the existing global order. The defeat and collapse of empires such as Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire created a power vacuum. In contrast, English-speaking countries, particularly the United States, which emerged economically stronger after the war, began to shape the post-war world. This shift had profound linguistic consequences. As American political and economic influence expanded, so did the reach of English. It started to be seen as the language of colonial administrators, but also as the language of commerce, diplomacy, and modernity. The ascendancy of the United States after the First War, marked the beginning of the American century, in which English was propelled to the forefront of global affairs. We will be talking about the American century in a minute. Even in international forums like the League of Nations and later the United Nations, English became one of the key working languages, further cementing its place in international discourse. Okay, let's go to the part 2. World War II and the rise of the United States. Here we have a a super famous picture of the Iwo Jima island in Japan, and the moment when they erected the American flag in this Japanese island. So after this war, we witnessed the acceleration of English as a global language. While World War I set the stage for the global spread of English due to all these technological advances, it was World War II that truly cemented the United States and, by extension, the English language as dominant forces in global politics, economics, science, and culture. The aftermath of war and the American century. The Second War between 1939 and 1945 left much of Europe and Asia in ruins. Cities were bombed out, economies were shattered, and colonial empires like those in Britain and France were weakening. In great contrast, the United States emerged economically and militarily stronger than ever before. By the end of the war, the US accounted for more than half of the world's industrial production. This economic power translated into global influence, both politically and culturally. In this picture, we have the Life, the super famous Life magazine, and an article that called this time in history the American century. This period marked the start of what historians often call the American century, a term first used by publisher Henry Luce in 1941 in Life magazine, as we see in the picture, to describe the expected role of the United States in shaping the post-war world order. English, as the primary language of the new superpower, gains symbolic and functional importance as the language of modernity, leadership, and opportunity. It's been 80 years, and the United States still continues as the superpower in charge. Let's see what happens in the near future with the new superpowers emerging, like China, probably Russia, South Korea. Yes, let's see what happens with the language. Okay, so diplomacy and the birth of global institutions. One of the most enduring impacts of the post-war period was the establishment of international organizations designed to promote peace, cooperation, and economic stability. The United Nations, founded in 1945, adopted 5 official languages, but English quickly became one of the dominant working languages, especially in documents, speeches, and day-to-day diplomacy. Similarly, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the famous NATO, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, which later evolved into the World Trade Organization, all used English as a primary working language. This was not only due to American influence, but also because English had become a practical lingua franca for international negotiations. The United States' leading role in founding and financing post-war international institutions helped to establish English as the default medium for diplomatic discourse. Okay, and now we go to our next picture: science, technology, and the language of innovation. In the decades following the war, the United States took the lead in scientific research, technological innovation, and higher education. Key developments such as the Manhattan Project on the left, led by Mr. Oppenheimer, the space race with the Soviet Union, and breakthroughs in computing, medicine, and engineering were largely conducted and published in English. As we discussed last week, English became the language of science and the publishing of all these papers and documents was in English. Academic journals and conferences became increasingly dominated by English language contributions. By the 1970s, English had become the primary language of scientific publication, even among researchers whose first language was not English. Today, over 90% of scientific articles are published in English. This linguistic shift in academia wasn't accidental. It was the result of funding, prestige, and accessibility. American universities like Harvard, MIT, and Stanford became global centers of excellence. Scholars around the world were incentivized to publish in English to gain international recognition, funding, and collaboration opportunities. And let's go back to the next slide. We have George Marshall, the famous Marshall Plan and cultural influence. A key mechanism for the spread of English and American influence was the Marshall Plan, officially the European Recovery Program, launched in 1948, 3 years after the ending of the Second War. This massive US aid package provided over $13 billion of the time, approximately $150 billion of today's dollars, to help rebuild Western Europe's economies. But the plan wasn't just economic, it was also cultural. With American and with all this money, with all this American investment, came American advisors, goods, media, and institutions. American ideas about business, democracy, and education accompanied the aid, and with them came, obviously, the English language. The Marshall Plan exported more than money. It exported American models of modernization, which included language management and cultural products. And then in the United States, we witnessed the rise of American media and consumer culture. We can see a picture here of New York, Broadway, the famous, what's the name? Times Square in New York. This period also witnessed the global expansion of American media, including Hollywood films, popular music, and television. These cultural exports were not only entertainment, they were vehicles for linguistic exposure. Even people in non-English speaking countries began to associate English with glamour, modernity, and social mobility. By social mobility, we mean the opportunity to go higher in the social scale. The cultural power of post-war America amplified the perception that English was not just useful, but aspirational. English became the language of the global dream, not only the famous American dream, but the whole global dream. A dream shaped by capitalism, technological advancement, and cultural soft power. Before we move on to the cultural boom that made English a global trend, let's think for a moment and pause to talk about something that often goes unnoticed: how the wars themselves helped standardize English in key areas of international life. During both wars, soldiers, commanders, and allies from different countries had to coordinate closely operations and rescue operations, etc. English emerged as a practical tool, a shared language for communication on the battlefield and in strategic planning. In many cases, it was simplified for clarity and speed. You can think of it as an early version of military English, focused on avoiding misunderstanding in high stakes environments. But it didn't stop there. After the Second War, with the rise of international aviation, English was formally adopted as the global language of flight. In 1951, the International Civil Aviation Organization made English the standard language for air traffic communication. That meant that pilots and air traffic controllers around the world, regardless of their native language, had to be trained in specific form of aviation English. Later on, this idea of standardizing English spread to other fields like diplomacy and technical writing. International organizations such as the United Nations and NATO began using English in a highly structured way, favoring clear, neutral, and universally understandable language. Even aerospace companies created something called simplified technical English, a version of English designed to reduce confusion in instruction manuals for global users. So, even before English became the language of pop culture, it had already been shaped into a kind of global operating system, streamlined, structured, and ready to be used across borders. Okay, so let's take that idea further because now we were talking about culture. So when Hollywood, rock and roll, and television entered the picture, English didn't just become useful, it became attractive and irresistible. So let's talk about the cultural explosion that followed. Part 3, cultural impact of English post-war, how entertainment, education, and pop culture globalized the language. While political dominance and scientific leadership laid the groundwork, the global spread of English truly accelerated through culture, especially in the aftermath of World War II. The mid to late 20th century witnessed an explosion of cultural export from English-speaking countries, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom, transforming English into a symbol of modernity, aspiration, and connection. Hollywood, the global dream machine. Wow. Here we have, I recognize Marilyn Monroe and on the left, okay, I forgot. In the years following World War II, Hollywood cinema became one of the most powerful cultural forces in the world. American movies were distributed widely, often dominating box offices, even in non-English speaking countries. These films showcased not just the English language, but also American values, fashion, consumer products, and lifestyle. Classic post-war films such as Casablanca, Rebel Without a Cause, and later blockbusters like Star Wars and E.T. became cultural touchstones. For millions of international viewers, watching these films was their first immersive experience with spoken English, and with it, American slang, idioms, and cultural references. Hollywood films have long served as a vehicle of American cultural diplomacy, presenting a stylized version of the American dream that made English not just comprehensible, but aspirational. And that's why millions and millions of people want to go there and live their American dream. Okay, let's talk about music, from jazz to hip hop. The global reach of American and British music after World War II was another major catalyst in spreading English. Jazz, rock and roll, soul, punk, pop, and later hip hop all originated in English speaking context but became worldwide movements. In the 1950s and 60s, Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry introduced rock and roll to a global audience. The British invasion of the 1960s, led by the Beatles, and we will have soon a program dedicated to this expansion of English by the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and The Who cemented English language music on the world stage. By the 1980s and 90s, artists like Michael Jackson, Madonna, and Whitney Houston had become global icons, with English language lyrics sung and memorized by fans from Tokyo to Sao Paulo and Bogota. English became the dominant language of global music, often preferred even by non native artists trying to reach international audiences. As a result, millions of people learned English informally through lyrics, rhymes, and repeated listening. Music operates as a powerful, soft power tool, one that embeds English into the daily lives and emotional memories of people around the globe. So, millions and millions every day in Bogota, in every Transmilenio, in every place, listen to music in English, probably without even noticing. Okay, television and the global village. The rise of television in the post war decades extended English uh, even further. American TV shows such as I Love Lucy, The Brady Bunch, and MASH gained international audiences. In the 1990s and 2000s, shows like Friends, The Simpsons, and CSI were broadcasted globally, often with subtitles rather than dubbing, meaning the change of the voices into Spanish, allowing viewers to hear native English while reading in their own language. British shows also made their mark. Doctor Who, Monty Python, and later Sherlock Holmes and The Crown, introducing global audiences to British English accents and humor. And also Mr. Bean, even though he didn't speak much. This ongoing exposure helped normalize English for millions, making it familiar and accessible, even if spoken with different accents or dialects. Education and the institutionalization of English. As the economic and cultural prestige of English speaking countries grew, English began to be taught as a second language in schools worldwide. Many governments, particularly in Europe, Asia, and Africa, introduced English instructions in primary or secondary curricula. By the late 20th century, English had become the default language of international higher education, especially in fields like business, science, and technology. That's why we have a second language requirement in our university, for example. A key to upward mobility, proficiency in English became a requirement for employment in multinational corporations, tourism, and diplomacy, a prerequisite for academic publishing and global scholarship, as discussed in part two. And the global demand for English has led to an entire industry of language learning, making English both a commodity and a gatekeeper for opportunity. Meaning that if your English is good, your opportunities for getting a better job are higher. This institutional support gave English a formal presence in education systems, further entrenching its role in shaping young minds and future professionals. Okay, pop culture icons and everyday language. From Elvis Presley and the Beatles to Beyoncé and Taylor Swift, English speaking celebrities have become household names around the world. Their influence has extended far beyond music into fashion, lifestyle, language trends, and even social values. American sitcoms like Friends and The Office, really reality shows like Keeping Up with the Kardashians, and streaming era hits like Stranger Things or Game of Thrones have had global fan bases that often interact with the content in its original English format. These cultural products introduce everyday idioms, meaning the expressions, jokes, slang, and cultural references that non-native speakers adopt into their own speech, either for practical use or to signal belonging in global youth culture. English has become a marker of cosmopolitan identity, even in non-English speaking societies. Using English expressions can signify modernity, trendiness, or global awareness. So we just mentioned aviation. So aviation, business, and the internet. Here in this slide, we can see the most spoken languages on the internet and in real life. So let's talk about this. Beyond pop culture, English became the official language of global aviation, as we just mentioned, standardized by the International Civil Aviation Organization in 1951, navigation in the seas, international business, and later the internet. By the 1990s, English dominated online content, including websites, email communication, and early chat forums. The rise of Silicon Valley tech giants, Google, Apple, Microsoft, Facebook, ensured that English would remain the default language of digital interaction. As of 2024, more than 50% of the web content remains in English, even though native English speakers make up less than 10% of the global population. Last week, we discussed how approximately 1,500 million people speak English as their native language, but 50% of the content online is in English. This created a feedback loop. More people wanted to learn English because it gave them access to knowledge, communication, entertainment, and economic opportunity. The post-war cultural explosion, from Hollywood films and pop music to educational systems and internet technologies, made English not just useful, but culturally irresistible. Through soft power and everyday exposure, English embedded itself in the global psyche, not only as a language of utility, but also as a language of identity, aspiration, and expression. Okay, so let's recap. English spread globally through a combination of historical events and cultural influences. World War I introduced English as a practical tool for communication among nations, and World War II solidified its role as the language of global leadership, technology, and pop culture. Now, here's a question for you. Where do you see the legacy of this history in your own experience with English? For example, are there English words or cultural references in your native language? Think about this in our Spanish in Colombia. Think about it and let us know in them. Send us a message. Here's another exercise. Can you name a movie, a song, or trend in your country that was inspired by English-speaking cultures? I'm sure we can, because we have all the movies and all the music, everything that is produced and popularized in the United States reaches our country as well. So send us a message if you want this topic to be featured in a future episode of our podcast. Okay, and that's it for this week. Thanks for listening. Please send us a message with your opinions and impressions on this episode, as well as your suggestions for improvement. And don't forget to tune in next week. Until then, keep learning and enjoying your English. Thank you very much, Leonardo. Thank you very much.
Tune in and speak up. Hello, English learners. Want to learn something interesting whilst having fun? Welcome to Tune In and Speak Up. the podcast where you'll get to know this beautiful language in depth. Each week, we'll dive into exciting topics, share practical tips, and tell you fascinating English language stories. So whether you're studying, going to work, or just relaxing, connect, listen, and let's make English part of your world. Wherever you are, whenever you want, just hit play, tune in and listen up. Tune in to U Radio every Tuesday from 11 a.m. till noon. Don't just learn English, live it.